She found the old woman at midnight. Barefoot. Soaking wet. Whispering to the rain like it owed her an answer. And the only person Grace could call for help was the one man in New York City she was most afraid to dial. Grace Ellison had spent 4 years cleaning this mansion. 4 years of 11 p.m. starts and 3 a.m. finishes, mopping marble floors worth more than her entire life, polishing chandeliers with cotton gloves, making herself small enough to disappear into the walls. She was good at that. Disappearing. At 25, she had turned invisibility into a survival skill, because in a house like this, the things you saw and the things you pretended not to see were the difference between a paycheck and a problem. Tonight, everything she had carefully built was about to come apart. It started with a sound. A soft, rhythmic tapping against the stone floor near the east garden entrance, the kind of sound that didn't belong in a mansion at midnight. Grace pushed open the heavy glass door, bucket in hand, and stopped cold. There she was. Mrs. Jin-Ho Kwan. 74 years old. Mother of the most feared man in New York. Sitting on the rain-soaked bottom step in a silk nightgown that had gone completely transparent from the water, her silver hair plastered flat, her bare feet turning a fragile shade of blue against the stone. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for help. She was just sitting there with her palms open on her knees, face tilted upward like she was waiting for something the sky had promised her a long time ago. Grace's bucket hit the floor with a clang that echoed through the garden. She was beside the old woman in 4 steps. Mrs. Kwan, oh no, 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 she stripped off her uniform jacket without thinking, wrapped it around those shaking shoulders, felt the ice of the old woman's skin beneath her hands. How long have you been out here? Mrs. Jin-Ho turned to look at her. Her eyes were soft. Lost. Somewhere between this world and another one entirely. I'm waiting, she whispered in Korean-accented English. He told me to wait right here. He said he's coming. Grace's chest broke quietly. Because nobody had told her to wait anywhere. Nobody was coming. This was the dementia speaking, inventing instructions, inventing people, anchoring her to a spot in the rain because the mind had found a story to explain the confusion, and the story said, stay. Grace stayed with her. Crouched on those cold steps, one arm around Mrs. Jin-Ho's shoulders, feeling the old woman's shaking move through her own bones. She rubbed warmth into those frail arms. She talked softly, about nothing, about everything, just sound and presence and the message, you are not alone, you are not alone, you are not alone. But Mrs. Jin-Ho kept slipping further. Her breathing was getting shallow. Her lips had taken on a color that made Grace's training kick in with a sharp, cold clarity. She needed warmth. She needed it now. And Grace could not carry her alone. There was a card in Grace's phone case. A small white card with a single handwritten number on it. Her supervisor had pressed it into her palm during orientation, his face doing something complicated while he spoke. Emergency only. And I mean real emergency. You'll know when. You'll wish you didn't. The number belonged to Jin-Ho Kwan. Grace had never once taken that card out. Not in 4 years. Not when a pipe burst in the West Wing. Not when a delivery driver crashed through the gate. Not for anything. Because calling that number meant entering a universe she had no business entering, the private universe of a man who ran things in this city that never appeared in any newspaper, a man whose silence in rooms was louder than other men's shouting, a man who had never looked directly at Grace in 4 years of her working 10 feet away from him. She was about to call that man. At midnight. To tell him his mother was dissolving in the rain. Her thumb was shaking when she pressed dial. She told herself it was the cold. 1 ring. Half a ring. Then, silence of a specific kind. The silence of someone who picked up but hasn't decided yet whether to speak. Who is this? Not a question. A sentence with the warmth of a steel door. Grace's voice came out steadier than she felt. Mr. Kwan. This is Grace. The night janitor. "Sir, I'm at the East Garden entrance and I have your mother." She came outside. "She's been in the rain and she looked at Mrs. Soon-yi, who had taken Grace's free hand in both of hers and was holding on with a grip that was surprisingly fierce, her eyes wide with a fear she couldn't name or locate or escape from. She was murmuring now. The same phrase. Over and over. In Korean and then in English. "Make it stop. Just make it stop. Make it stop." Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. "Sir, your mother is shaking. She's begging me to shoot her." The words tore out of her because they were the truest thing she could say. Not a request to die, she understood that. It was the sound of a woman in unbearable confusion, asking for the pain of being lost to end in the only language her frightened mind could find. Dead silence on the line. For seconds that felt like standing on the edge of something with no bottom. Then the line cut. Grace sat in the rain and held Mrs. Soon-yi's hand and waited. She didn't know what was coming. She didn't know if she still had a job. She didn't know if she'd just made the worst decision of her life. If you've ever had to make a call that terrified you, stay with us. Because what came around that corner next changed Grace's life forever. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens. She only knew she wasn't moving from this step until this woman was safe. Whatever it cost. 8 minutes. That was all it took for the world to rearrange itself. Grace heard the engines before she saw the lights, a low, controlled growl coming from the direction of the main gate, the kind of sound that expensive machinery makes when it's being driven by someone who has somewhere to be and the authority to get there without delay. 2 black SUVs materialized from the dark like they'd peeled themselves off the night sky. No sirens. No urgency in the obvious sense. Just arrival, total and immediate and complete. The rear door of the first vehicle opened before it fully stopped. Jin-Ho Kwan stepped into the rain. Grace had watched this man from a distance for 4 years. Had studied the geometry of him the way you study weather, not out of interest, but out of self-preservation. She knew the way a room changed when he entered it, knew the particular quality of stillness that preceded his decisions, knew that the suits he wore never had a crease in them and that his staff moved with a kind of hell-breath precision in his presence. But she had never seen him like this. No jacket. Dark shirt, collar open, which meant they had pulled him from wherever he went when the doors closed and the city didn't watch. His hair was slightly undone. And he crossed from that vehicle to his mother in long, fast strides that were as close to running as a man like Jin-Ho Kwan would ever allow himself to get in front of witnesses. He dropped to one knee on the wet stone in front of Mrs. Soon-yi. One knee. On the ground. In the rain. Grace's breath caught somewhere in her chest and stayed there. He cupped his mother's face in both hands and spoke to her in Korean, low, steady, the kind of voice that doesn't perform calmness but actually has it, buried deep where it doesn't shake. Grace couldn't follow every word, but she caught the shape of it. I'm here. I'm right here. Look at me. I'm here. Mrs. Soon-yi blinked. Focused. And then, slowly, something surfaced in her eyes. Recognition. Like a light coming on in a house you thought was empty. She whispered his name. The sound Jin-Ho made in response was barely audible. A single breath. But Grace felt it like a fist closing around something in her ribcage. He gathered his mother up like she was made of something irreplaceable, which she was, and carried her to the vehicle in silence. His men materialized around him, umbrellas appearing, doors swinging open, a warm blanket produced from somewhere before he'd even reached the curb. Jin-Ho settled Mrs. Soon-yi into the back seat with a tenderness so at odds with everything Grace had been told about this man that she stood there blinking rain out of her eyes, wondering if she was watching the right person. He closed the door. Turned around. And looked directly at Grace. The full weight of Jin-Ho Kwan's attention was a physical thing. Like stepping from shade into direct sunlight, sudden, total, impossible to be casual about. He had never once looked at her like this. For 4 years she had been part of the architecture. Now she was something else. Something his dark eyes were measuring with a focus that had no softness in it and no malice either. Just precision. Assessment. The gaze of a man who was very good at determining exactly what something was. Grace stood her ground. Soaking wet, in a janitor's uniform, jacket gone, rain running freely down her face. She didn't look away. She didn't apologize with her posture. His expression shifted by a fraction, something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite respect but lived in the same neighborhood as both. "Get in the car," he said. "Mr. Kwan, I can get home on my own, I didn't mean to intrude on your Grace." Her own name in his mouth stopped her completely. In 4 years, this man had never said her name. She hadn't been sure he knew it. "Get in the car." She got in the car. The ride back to the mansion took 6 minutes. Nobody spoke a single word. Grace sat in the front passenger seat with her hands in her lap and her eyes forward, listening to the city slide past in the rain. In the back, through the partition glass, she could see Jin-Ho's reflection, seated beside his mother, one hand resting over hers on the seat cushion. Mrs. Suni had fallen asleep before they reached the first light. The way she leaned against her son's shoulder, and the way he let her, adjusting slightly so she was more comfortable without waking her, that small thing, that wordless adjustment, stayed in Grace's chest like a splinter. Impossible to remove. Too small to explain. Inside the mansion, 2 nurses appeared from nowhere. A Dr. Grace had never seen materialized from a corridor she hadn't known connected to anything useful. Mrs. Suni was moved upstairs with the smooth, practiced efficiency of people who had protocol for exactly this. Within 10 minutes, the entrance hall was quiet again. Jin-Ho stood in the center of it. He hadn't sat down. Hadn't taken water or a towel or anything his staff had quietly offered. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at Grace the way you look at a question you weren't expecting. "You stayed with her the whole time?" "Yes, sir." "How long was she outside before you found her?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe 20 minutes by the time I got to her. Maybe more." The stone under her feet was cold all the way through. Something tightened in his jaw. Not at Grace past her. At something he was calculating internally. "You took your jacket off and put it on her." Grace blinked. "Yes. In December. She needed it more than I did." Silence moved through the entrance hall like weather. Jin-Ho studied her with that same precise attention that had no warmth in it and no cruelty either, just the quality of someone taking something very seriously. "You called me," he said. "You were afraid to." It wasn't a question, so Grace didn't treat it like one. "Terrified," she said simply. "But you called anyway." "Your mother was alone in the rain, sir. Being afraid of you wasn't really the most important thing happening." Something moved across Jin-Ho's face. It was brief, barely a second, but Grace saw it. A shift. Like a curtain pulled back by the wind and immediately released. He turned away. Walked 3 steps. Stopped. "You'll stay in the East Wing tonight. A room is being prepared." "Mr. Kwan, that's not necessary. I can go home and come back for my morning. Your shifts are suspended until further notice." The words landed with a quiet, final weight that left no space for negotiation. Grace understood, in the particular way that intelligent people understand things they would rather not, that she was not being offered hospitality. She was being contained. She had walked into the most private moment this man had experienced in, she suspected, a very long time. She had witnessed the crack in the armor. She had heard what his voice sounded like when his mother whispered his name. In a world built entirely on the management of perception, that made her a liability. "I understand," Grace said. Because she did. She followed a silent housekeeper through corridors she had only ever cleaned, to a room she had only ever polished. She sat on the edge of a bed with linen sheets that cost more than her rent, in a wing of a mansion she'd spent 4 years making invisible inside, and she pressed her palms flat against her knees and breathed. The rain tapped against the window. Patient. Steady. Like it was keeping time for something. She was not a prisoner. She was also not free. She was somewhere in the complicated country between those two things, which, she thought, staring at the ceiling, was more honest than most of the places she'd occupied in her life. At least here, the terms were clear. She thought about Jin-Ho kneeling in the rain. About his mother's face when recognition surfaced. About the way he'd said her name Grace, like he'd been holding it somewhere and finally decided to use it. She turned off the lamp. She did not sleep for a long time. 5 days passed inside the mansion like water moving under ice, everything still on the surface, everything shifting underneath. Grace was watched. Not obviously. Not the way they watched in movies, with men in corners and cameras you could see. She was watched the way expensive establishments watch people they're unsure about, attentively, from a distance, through other people who seem to simply be going about their business. Jin-Ho's second-in-command, a composed man named Derek who wore his danger quietly and his charm loudly, came to speak with her on the second morning. He asked pleasant questions over coffee she hadn't requested, and every pleasant question had a careful architecture beneath it, testing what she had seen. What she had retained, whether the thing she was could be trusted or only managed. Grace answered everything honestly and told him nothing. On the 4th day, she was permitted access to the garden. She sat on a stone bench near the fountain in the pale winter morning and watched the frost on the ornamental grass catch the light and thought about her sister Camille, back in Massachusetts, who texted every morning and had no idea where Grace currently was. She thought about whether to be frightened. Decided she'd already used up most of her fright in the rain and there wasn't much left. Footsteps behind her. Different from the staff's. Heavier. More deliberate. The sound of someone accustomed to making rooms rearrange themselves. Jin-Ho Kwan sat down at the opposite end of the bench. Grace kept her eyes on the garden. If he needed her to look at him, he would say so. Silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, which surprised her. Jin-Ho seemed to have no anxiety about silence whatsoever, which meant he either felt it served him or he simply hadn't noticed that most people found it unbearable. Grace suspected the former. She asked about you this morning. Mrs. Kwan? On a clear day. She gets perhaps 2 or 3 each week now. He said this without sentimentality, in the tone of a man who has made peace with a fact through the sheer exhaustion of fighting it. She asked where the woman was. The one who sat with her in the rain. She called you, he paused almost imperceptibly, steadfast. Grace felt something pull behind her sternum. How is she today? Asleep. Comfortable. He looked at the fountain. Better than last week. The week before that was worse. I'm sorry, Grace said. And she meant it the whole way down. You took care of her, Jin-Ho said, and there was something in the way he said it that was different from every other sentence he'd constructed so far. Less measured. More direct. Like something that had bypassed the editing process. When she was most frightened and most lost, you sat on that step in the cold and you held her hand and you talked to her. You didn't leave to find someone else. You didn't leave at all. She was holding my hand, Grace said simply. You don't pull away from that. The silence that followed was different from the one before it. Fuller. Like something had been added to the air. My men believe you are a risk, Jin-Ho said. And his voice returned to its usual register, measured and even. That the right decision is to move you somewhere removed from this household until they're satisfied you won't talk. Grace turned to look at him directly for the first time. And what do you believe? He met her eyes without hesitation. There was no performance in his gaze and no shield either, just the unadorned attention of someone who had decided to be accurate. I believe, he said, that a woman who strips off her own jacket in December to put around a stranger and then sits on a wet stone step for 20 minutes in the cold, not because anyone was watching, not because there was any benefit to her, but simply because it was the right thing, is not someone who talks. He stood. Straightened the line of his jacket. You will be compensated for the days missed. You may resume your position tomorrow, if you choose. A pause. Waited. Or you may consider a different role. My mother's daytime companion. The pay is 5 times your current rate. Grace stared at him. You have until this evening, he said, and walked back toward the mansion without looking back. She sat alone on that bench for a long time. The frost was melting. The garden was very quiet. She thought about 5 times her salary. About Camille in Massachusetts. About the 4 years of invisibility that had taught her exactly how much it cost to be unseen. She thought about Mrs. Suni calling her steadfast. She already knew her answer. The only question was whether she was brave enough to give it. She said yes. And for 6 weeks, the mansion became a different place. Grace moved through it differently now, not with a mop and bucket and the practiced invisibility of the help, but with purpose, with direction, with a role that had weight. She spent her days with Mrs. Suni. Reading to her on the good days, sitting quietly with her on the hard ones, learning the particular rhythms of a mind that was slowly losing its map. She learned which songs could reach Mrs. Suni when nothing else could. Learned that she responded to the smell of ginger tea and the sound of rain on windows with something close to peace. Learned that on the very worst days, when the confusion was total and the fear was enormous, the thing that helped most was the simplest, holding both her hands and saying, clearly and calmly, "You are safe, I am right here, you are not alone." Mrs. Suni started calling her Gracia. The Korean diminutive. Tender and familiar. Like something you only add to names that belong to people you've decided to keep. Jin-Ho noticed. Grace could tell, not because he said anything, but because the way he moved through the rooms adjacent to his mother's had changed slightly. Less surveillance. More something else she didn't have a word for. They spoke, in passing. Brief exchanges at first. Then longer ones, when Mrs. Suni was napping and Jin-Ho came to check on her and Grace was still in the chair by the window with a book open in her lap. They talked about small things, the garden, what Mrs. Suni had eaten, whether the new medication was helping. Then gradually, without a clear moment of transition, larger things. His mother's history. What she had been like before. She used to sing while she cooked, he said once, looking at his mother's sleeping face with an expression that contained an entire archive of grief. The whole house would smell like the food and sound like her voice. Now, he didn't finish it. He didn't need to. Then the shooting happened. And everything fractured. Grace was reading to Mrs. Suni in the sitting room, a clear day, her eyes bright, her commentary sharp and funny, when 2 gunshots cracked through the west wing of the mansion like the building had been struck by lightning from the inside. Mrs. Suni's hand locked around Grace's wrist. The brightness in her eyes went out, replaced instantly by the animal fear that dementia lives closest to. "I've got you," Grace said immediately. Calm. Absolute. "You're safe. Stay right here." She settled Mrs. Suni into her chair, turned on the small television she loved, and stepped into the corridor. The house had become a different creature in the 30 seconds since the shots. Men moving in patterns. Doors closing. Derek materializing from the direction of the west wing, his composure cracked at the edges for the first time Grace had ever seen. His eyes landed on her and he made a decision in real time. "West corridor," he said. "Go." Grace ran. She found Jin-Ho on the floor outside his office, one arm braced against the wall, one hand pressed against his side, his shirt soaked through with red. 2 of his men crouched over him doing the right things but doing them with the trembling imprecision of people whose training was colliding with the reality of watching their employer bleed on the floor. Grace dropped beside him. Her hands were already moving. "Move back," she said, and something in her voice, some quality of absolute certainty, made both men move. She pressed both palms hard against the wound and felt Jin-Ho tighten beneath her hands, a sharp breath through clenched teeth. Look at me, she said. His eyes found her face. Dark. Glassy at the edges. But present. You're going to breathe slowly. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Don't stop looking at me. The Viper's men, they got through the, not right now. Right now you breathe. Something in the flatness of it reached him. His breathing steadied into something more controlled. His eyes, which had been unfocusing at the edges, locked back onto hers with the grip of someone grabbing a rope. You're not panicking, he said, rough, slightly disbelieving. My mother was a trauma nurse in California for 20 years, Grace said, keeping the pressure steady. She made me sit through every training video she ever had. You breathe. The 4 minutes before the medical team arrived were the longest of Grace's life. She stayed exactly where she was, hands on the wound, eyes on his face, talking him through every breath with the steady authority her mother had carried into every emergency room she'd ever entered. Jin-Ho looked at her the entire time. Not past her. Not at the ceiling. At her. Like she was the only fixed point in a room that was spinning. In the fever of blood loss, somewhere in the 3rd minute, he started to talk. Quietly. The voice of a man whose defenses had sprung a leak too large to manage. He talked about being a boy in a thunderstorm. About the day his father left and never came back. About building an empire to protect one person and becoming something that frightened that person in the process. About the night Grace called, about what it had done to him, standing in the rain, carrying his mother, knowing that a woman with no power and no protection had sat on a cold step and refused to leave her. You came yourself, Grace said softly. You didn't send anyone. She's my mother, he said. As if that were the whole universe contained in 3 words. The medical team arrived. Grace stepped back. Her hands were red. Her heart was somewhere outside her chest. She stood in that corridor and felt the world settle into a new shape around her, not the shape it had been an hour ago. Something different. Something that had no clean name yet. She washed her hands. Walked back to Mrs. Suni. Sat down in the chair by the window. Took the old woman's hand. Is he all right? Mrs. Suni asked. Her eyes clear. Watching Grace's face. Grace thought about the floor. About his eyes finding hers and staying. About she's my mother spoken like a law of nature. He will be, Grace said. And she meant it. Jin-Ho Kwan survived. The wound was serious. The recovery was slow. And somewhere inside that slowness, the last walls came down. Grace came every morning. She told herself it was for Mrs. Suni, which was true. But it wasn't only true, and she was too honest to pretend otherwise for long. She sat at Jin-Ho's bedside in the medical wing with a book or without one, and they talked the way people talk when the performance is over and only the real thing remains. He told her about the boy underneath the empire, afraid of storms, loyal beyond reason, grieving in a language nobody around him spoke. She told him about her own life, growing up in California with a trauma nurse mother who treated every crisis with the same controlled calm, about her sister Camille in Massachusetts, about 4 years of making herself invisible in this house and what it had quietly taken from her. Not bitterly. Just truthfully. Because he listened the way almost nobody listened, completely, without preparing his response while she was still speaking. 4 years, he said once. You were here 4 years and I never, he stopped. Started again. That is not something I can correct. But it is something I understand differently now. I know, Grace said. That's enough. The Viper's network was dismantled over the following weeks, thoroughly, finally, in the way that Jin-Ho Kwan did everything when he had decided it was finished. Grace stayed out of the details. She understood the shape of it without needing the specifics, and when it was over, the house exhaled in a way she felt in her own body. The shadow men relaxed by degrees. Derek smiled with something that reached his eyes. Mrs. Suni had 4 clear days in a row, which hadn't happened in months. On the evening Jin-Ho was cleared by his doctors, he walked to the garden for the first time since the shooting. Grace was already there, the same bench, the same fountain, the city lights beginning to come on beyond the wall in the early dusk. She heard his footsteps and didn't turn around. He sat down. Not at the far end this time. Closer. They were quiet together for a while. The garden had a particular peace to it in the early evening, not silence exactly, but the softer sound of a world winding down, of birds and distant traffic and the fountain doing what fountains do, unhurried and continuous. "My mother had a good day today," he said. "I know. She told me about a dress she wore to a New Year's celebration years ago. She described it for 40 minutes. It sounded beautiful. It was." A pause. "I bought it for her. Her 60th birthday." Grace turned to look at him. His profile against the fading light, the sharp jaw, the architecture of someone built for endurance, had lost something in the weeks of recovery. Not strength. Something harder than strength. The specific rigidity of a man who believes he cannot afford to be soft had loosened, incrementally, in the weeks of being allowed to be unwell, to be tended to be seen. "Grace." "Yes. When you called me that night," he stopped. "Started differently. I have made decisions in my life that I cannot undo. I have built things I cannot dismantle. There is a cost to what I am and I do not pretend otherwise." He turned to look at her. Directly. Completely. "But I want you to know that who you are, the way you stayed on that step, the way you talked to her, the way you pressed your hands against my side on that floor and told me to breathe like I was worth the effort, that has changed something in me that I did not believe was still capable of being changed." The fountain played its steady note. The city glittered and breathed beyond the wall. Grace felt the whole weight of it, the midnight rain, the barefoot old woman, the terrifying phone call, the blood on the floor, the 3 in the morning conversations, all of it, settle into a shape she hadn't been able to see clearly until this moment. It wasn't a neat shape. It had no clean edges. But it was real and it was hers. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Not a declaration. Not a promise made to impress. Just the plainest possible truth, offered without decoration. Jin-Ho looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the same nod she'd seen him give his most trusted men when something had been decided and no more words were required. That evening, the three of them had dinner together in the small round-table room off the garden that Mrs. Suni preferred because the chairs didn't match and it reminded her of her mother's kitchen in Seoul decades ago. Mrs. Suni told a story about a young Jin-Ho crying during a thunderstorm and trying to convince everyone he had something in his eye. Jin-Ho looked at the wall with a pained dignity that made Grace laugh until she had to press her napkin to her face. Mrs. Suni beamed. She held both their hands before the food came and looked between them with the expression of someone completing a picture they'd been working on for longer than anyone else knew. Outside, the sky was clear. No rain. Just the city laid out in every direction, lit and alive, going about the business of being itself. Grace Ellison had come to this mansion 4 years ago with a mop and a policy of invisibility. She had made herself small enough to disappear into the walls, small enough to be safe, small enough to be nobody's problem and nobody's concern. And then one night at midnight, in December, in the rain, she had found an old woman sitting alone on a cold step. And she had stayed. Not because it was safe. Not because anyone was watching. Not because there was a benefit to it. But because the woman was frightened and the step was cold and some things are simply not something you walk away from. That one decision, made in the rain, in the dark, at the cost of everything she had carefully constructed, had led her here. To this table. To this family. To a life she hadn't known to want because she'd spent too long building a life that was only about surviving. She looked at Mrs. Suni laughing at her own story. She looked at Jin-Ho watching his mother laugh with an expression that had nothing left to hide. She felt the warmth of the room and the weight of the city just outside it, and the particular quality of belonging that she had been told, in various ways by various circumstances, was not meant for a woman like her. She decided, quietly and completely, that those circumstances had been wrong. The most dangerous thing Grace Ellison ever did was pick up a phone at midnight and tell the truth. And it gave her everything. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that staying when it's hard is the bravest thing there is. Subscribe and turn on notifications. A brand new story, every single week. We'll see you next time.